All right. So anytime I'm recording these, they will be posted onto my YouTube channel. And I typically will try and post the Zoom link, or I'll probably just post the YouTube link on the Blackboard site as well, just so you have it for reference. So if you're not already, you don't have to subscribe to my channel, but check it periodically. Right now, I'm just going to be adding videos that pertain to you, Allegheny Nursing 110 and then Boyce 110. And to be honest with you, both classes are about the same. There's some discrepancy on how they do their test, but it's pretty much the same. So what you're going to do is you're responsible for knowing how to do these things. And if you're wondering which class do you learn these things, you're in that class. There is no separate class for doing and learning your dosage calculations. They're expecting that you know how to do these things and to pass it. And they're basing it off of A, just kind of doing some practice, B, your previous kind of, your bio 110 or 151, your chemistry, things like that. Or if you've had NSG 104 or the math 108, then you've been introduced to a lot of these concepts. But there's not a separate class. Like I said, you're in it right now. This is the class. So it's free for you. You don't need to sign up for anything other than just to come in and watch. And then learn and ask questions. So the first thing you're going to be responsible for is conversions. So you're going to be doing metric to metric conversions, meaning that you need to know how to convert grams to milligrams, convert milligrams to grams, convert micrograms to milligrams, milligrams to micrograms. You're going to have to know how to do those, and you're going to have to know what those conversions are, because they will not be provided for you on the test. Okay. And like I said, we'll practice these enough where you will at least know or have an idea of how to do them. And then I'll give you some tips on how to remember what those numbers are. You will also need to know how to convert milliliters to liters and then liters to milliliters. You need to know how to convert sometimes, and no, I won't even say it because it doesn't apply to this. You also need to know how to convert household measurements, meaning how do you convert teaspoons and tablespoons to milliliters, ounces to milliliters. And then I'll also show you, just because you might see it show up at some point, cups, pints, quarts, and how to convert those ultimately into ounces and into milliliters, in the event that you needed to calculate, what a patient intake of fluids was in a given scenario. So that's the household measurements. And now the household measurements, because it even says between metric and household, so I kind of overlap that with the metric unit conversions. And that's because the way that this blueprint is written is actually a little bit incorrect. And I'll explain why in just a second. But the metric unit conversions, like I said, grams to milligrams. We're really not going to be doing kilograms to grams, although I can show you that. But in medicine, or at least in nursing, we're really not measuring anything at the kilogram level other than the patient's weight. When you are doing grams, milligrams, micrograms, that's typically what a typical dose range is going to be. So like if you have, a bottle of, even just over the counter anything, or even if you have supplements, if you look in there, you'll see most of your supplements, even like a multivitamin, you'll see things listed in milligrams and micrograms. Very rarely do you see things listed in grams, and let alone kilograms. Okay. You will need to know how to convert pounds to kilograms, which in my mind is part of like household measurement converting. Basically everything you're trying, or you're being taught, and what you're what you're learning is how to convert into the metric system, because the metric system is the universal system that's used everywhere, and especially in healthcare. Everywhere meaning like beyond the United States. Okay. So those two things, you might be familiar with these first like 8 questions. Okay. where you might say like, oh, okay, I've at least seen that type of question before. Convert, 2 cups to ounces, or convert a pint to milliliters, or convert teaspoon, 2.5 teaspoons to milliliters, convert, 10 milligrams to micrograms, or 125 micrograms to milligrams. You've probably at least seen that. And what I'm saying right now isn't too kind of alarming. You're familiar with the terminology. Then we'll do some what are called intake and output calculation questions. These are things like, if you've looked at the practice set already, it'll be things like the fluid replacement volume question, which is actually a little bit of a tricky and challenging question, but we'll go through it. And then I'm also going to add some intake questions, because I think it'll be good practice for you, just in case they start to implement that in the coming semesters. Then what I think most students usually do really well with are these the oral and the parenteral medications. So 11 of these questions you're probably already somewhat familiar with. This is where you see a question that says, the doctor ordered the patient 500 milligrams of cephalexin, BID, QD, PO, and then it says, and then it'll tell you like an available, or show you a label, and the label will say 250 milligram capsules. And so you don't even have to have any kind of, strong math backing to realize like, oh, okay, if it's 500 is the order, 250 is available, I'm going to give them 2, and you would be correct with saying that 2 per dose. Those are your oral medications. Okay, typically it's just one step. This is where a lot of students learn desired over have, or I call it order over available, because that's using the same terminology in the questions. Then there are the parenteral medications, which basically just mean, the parenteral medications just basically mean they're the injectables. Okay. Now you're going to calculate the injectables the same way you would calculate something that's like you would take orally, but is a liquid. So like if let's just use that same cephalexin, 500 milligrams, but let's say it's available in 125 milligrams per 5 ml. Then what you're doing is you realize that's a liquid suspension. They're going to drink the antibiotic, and you need to calculate milliliters to get to, because that's the standard unit for measuring what you want to do. And like I said, we'll go through plenty of examples. I'm just trying to introduce some of these things so you know what these terms are when we come back and visit them. Okay. So oral and parenteral medications are pretty much going to be calculated the same way. It's either going to be you're looking for capsules or tablets or caplets, or you're looking for milliliters. Okay. Then we'll introduce reconstitution. Reconstitution is basically just means that you have a powdered substance, you add water to it to get to a certain concentration, and then you administer it. So the tricky part with reconstitution a lot of times is just reading the label to get to the information you need to administer the medication. But because reconstitution, I just told you, you're adding water to it. It's a powder that you're adding water to it. You're turning it, it's a suspension. And so you're going to, once you learn what the strength is, then it's just a matter of calculating the milliliters. And like I said, all that will make a lot more sense when I show you some of the example questions with that. And then lastly, this is just, can you read a syringe? Can you mark a syringe? And can you follow a table that would fit into what we call the sliding scale? And the sliding scale just means, if the patient has a blood sugar reading of in this range, you're going to administer, 2 units of insulin. And can you interpret the data that's presented to you in a sliding scale? And like I said, once you see that, you'll be like, oh, okay, that's not bad at all. Now, my intention is with this class is I want to kind of introduce you to definitely the things for 110. But then I also want to go in and introduce you to some of the things that you're going to see in the follow-up semesters, 130, 220, 230, and 240. But I'll kind of segregate that and say you don't need to worry about this for the 110, but this is something that you can come back to if you need to. Just because every semester, just like I know I imagine there's over 100 students just at Allegheny campus alone in the 110 program, and there's 5 of you here right now, and I know I can't accommodate everyone's schedule, so I'm hoping that at least other people will watch the replay on this. But I will say that a lot of students will come to me, second, third semester, and it's like the first time they're seeing some of these things, and I just want to make sure that I introduce you to pretty much everything throughout the course of the couple weeks that we have together working virtually. Okay. So those are the questions that you're responsible for knowing. And if you're sitting there going like, well, how are we supposed to know this? Well, that's a good question. My guess is that it's in your 110 packet, but they just don't cover it as a separate class because, like I said, they kind of just give that to me to provide to you. And anyways, that's why that is. There's a couple of things that that they kind of nitpick on, and that's what these other rules are. So I didn't make these rules up. When you see these later on, these are rules that were put together by the nursing department. And basically, there's just a couple things. Things that they're looking for are make sure that you label your medication correctly. So I had a student that's at Boyce campus, second semester, and she failed her test because she didn't put the correct unit designation on it. So she got the numbers right. She got the numbers right in all 25 questions, but missed labeling the thing, or just labeled it incorrectly. And so and she was like kicking herself because she did it. It was the same question type 3 times, and that's all she missed was 3 questions. So that leads me to, because I didn't mention this yet, your test is 25 questions. You can miss 2 and you pass. If you miss 3 or more, then you have to remediate and take a retake within a week or so. If unfortunately you don't pass the retake, they're going to withdraw you from 110. So even though it seems like there should be a little bit more like emphasis on this stuff, and maybe that's why some of you are on here because you heard that and got scared. But I will tell you, this is not this is supposed to be kind of, you should know this already sort of material and sort of math, but having worked with nursing students now since I started working with the nursing program in 2008, nursing students are just like any other good quantity of students. There's a lot of you that have math anxiety. You didn't get into nursing because you wanted to be a math person. I understand that. So I'm going to try and help you navigate this stuff. So that way you're getting the answers correctly. And some of that just comes down to practicing the material, practicing the questions, and then going through and practicing the process of getting to those answers. So we'll, like I said, talk about that. So a couple things that you want to pay attention to with labeling. A lot of times, especially at Allegheny campus, it's going to ask you how many milligrams, how many milliliters, how many tablets, how many units. It usually asks you specifically what they're looking for. Just make sure you include it. When you are in the sciences, especially healthcare, your answer should never be 5, because I'm sure you had a teacher like this, and if I taught this differently than what we're expressing it here, I would follow up with 5 what. Okay. And the reason we say 5 what is because, is it 5 inches, 5 miles, 5 years, 5 days, 5 hours? Like, what are we talking about here? So you want to make sure you denote what you're talking about. Nothing will ever be answered just a number. It's always going to be 90 kilograms, 2.25 milligrams. You're always going to have some sort of label associated with your numbers. Zeros, this is not usually an issue for most students, but if you have something like, it says use a leading zero for doses less than 1 milliliters, all that means is if you get an answer that's 0.5 milliliters, you want to write it out as 0.5 milliliters. Don't just write 0.5. And you might be thinking, well, why? What's the big deal? The big deal is that sometimes if you write that, or even if you type it, sometimes you don't see the decimal in front. It's very easily missed. And so you could over administer a medication if that were to happen in kind of like a clinical or real world situation. The other thing is you don't want to use trailing zeros, meaning that if you do get 0.5, leave it at 0.5. Do not do 0.50, okay? Because then again, the same problem comes with, well, what if you wrote 0.50 and then now they're reading in 50 milliliters and it should be half a milliliter, then there's a problem with that, okay? So that's not usually a problem. I don't know of any students who have missed points because of the zeros, but I think it's just because most students already know that they wouldn't think to do that. But the reason it's in the blueprint is because other students have made that mistake of putting it there. So just letting you know that's why that is the way it is. Rounding. We're going to talk rounding a lot in this class in 110. And the rounding rules are, like I said, they're right here in the blueprint. You'll hear me repeat them often, but it's important to kind of start off with what those are. And then anytime, and you're going to hear, because if you come on to multiple review sessions, it'll be someone's first review session, and they're always going to ask the same question. When do I round? Why do I round? Should I round this? Why didn't we round this? And so a lot of it comes in here. And we're going to talk about it here in just a moment, but I just want you to know that it's a commonly asked thing. Don't feel embarrassed to ask. I get asked that question for second, third, and fourth semester. I get emails, I get private messages when we're doing these Zoom meetings. Hey, remind me of rounding, please. This is what this is for. I'm not here to tell you like, oh, why don't you know that? You should know that already. I don't anticipate you knowing it very well because you're thinking about other things. Okay. But when it comes to rounding, we're going to be looking at things. So they actually specifically talk about rounding when it comes to milliliters, but rounding could occur with just about anything. But typically, it's the milliliters that you're going to see rounding. So if you have a volume that's greater than 1 milliliter, you are going to calculate it to the nearest tenth. Okay. Now, if you have, let's say your answer is 10 milliliters, that's your answer. Okay. But if you get something that's like, let's say you get an answer of 1.25 milliliters. Okay. The way that rounding works is, and forgive me if this is something you already know, this is not a, not meant to insult your intelligence if it's something you already got down, but again, something that's commonly missed, so I should tell you. You're going to look at the 5. So if that number to the right of the tenths place, which is called the hundredths place, if that's 5 or greater, you round up. If it's 4 or fewer, you don't round up. You leave it at that number. So as the example is, if you have 1.25 milliliters, we're going to round the 2 to a 3. So your final answer is 1.3 milliliters. Now, the reason for this is because a lot of times your syringes that are greater than 1 milliliter only go to the 10th. Okay. When you get smaller syringes, they actually can go way down. They can go to the hundredths to the thousandths place, but you don't need to necessarily worry about that from the standpoint of this test. But you will see examples of different syringe types as we kind of go along. If I have 1.24 milliliters, then what you're going to do is you're going to look at that number 4, that if it's 4 or fewer, so 43210, then you leave it alone. You do not round that up. You just leave it as 1.2. So that's rounding. So most things you're going to round to the 10th. You'll hear me say when you convert pounds to kilograms, some of your answers will be something like 45.43434343. Round your answer to the nearest 10th. You're always going to hear me do that. Okay. You're pretty much going to be rounding to the nearest 10th in most situations. In your, as far as rounding is concerned. And then there's a few exceptions, and we'll talk about those exceptions in a little bit. Now, if you have a volume that's less than 1 milliliter, so 0.99 and less, now I will say if it's 0.99, then it's 1. But if it's 1 milliliter or less, then you're going to actually take it to the next level. So you actually don't want to just round to the nearest 10th. You actually want to round to the nearest 100th if it's a number smaller than 1. And that's only if you get something like 0.125 or you get 0.78787878, some sort of like repeating number. I would say one of the common ones is like 0.33333333. Okay. It's just a repeating 3 decimal. So what you do is in this situation, you're always going to look at that third number. Okay. Now, in most situations, there may not even be a third number, but they're going to be looking for you to make sure that you have 2 significant numbers when it comes to milliliters. So if you have a 0.969, you're going to round that to 0.97. You might argue, isn't that just close enough to 1? Yes, this is just a bad example. So I would argue that you probably could just say 1 milliliter, but just follow the rules and you'll see some of the more realistic examples other than this 0.969 example. And then again, 0.963, again, it's 4 or fewer, so you would not round that up. You would just leave it at 0.96. But a more realistic situation is going to be, you're going to get an answer that says 0.25 milliliters. Leave that as your answer. Don't round that to 0.3. Leave it at 0.25. What they're asking for is if you have a volume less than 1,000th, less than 1 milliliter, they want to see it to the thousandths place. Can you get an answer of 0.5? Yeah. And remember, you don't do a lagging 0. So you don't do 0.50. You would leave your answer as 0.5. It's only if there's a number in the hundredths place that you need to even worry about that. So less than 1, more than 1 number past the decimal, then you want to incorporate just the 2 numbers. So that way you're being as specific as possible. Now, if we're doing basic like unit to unit conversions, meaning if I'm staying within the same system, like the metric system, and I go from milligrams to grams or micrograms to milligrams, if you get a decimal, let's say you get a decimal answer that's like 0.1275. And I know I'm saying this and maybe you're writing this down, but like I said, I'm going to give you plenty of examples, so don't worry about it too much. But let's say I get an answer of 0.1275. When you're just doing a simple metric to metric conversion, you don't round those answers. You just leave them alone. But that only applies when you have, like I said, a question such as convert, I'm trying to think what that would be. 127.5 micrograms to milligrams. And then the answer to that would be 0.1275 milligrams. That's your answer. Do not change your answer. Do not round that at all. And you'll hear me say that and hear me repeat that. That's the one caveat that I'll say in regards to rounding, is that you do not round when you're in the metric system. So metric to metric conversions. And those are usually like your first 4 or 5 questions is where you'll see something like that. We'll practice that. You'll hear me repeat that. I'll quiz you on it. You'll get it wrong, and I'll remind you not to round in those situations. And then what you're going to get frustrated with is remembering when to round, when not to round, which is why it's always a good idea to refer back to the blueprint or ask me when you have access to me when you're going through this stuff. Okay. Some of your questions will involve utilizing calculating time. So you need to learn, if you don't already know, military time, meaning like the day starts at 0, and then 0100 is 1 a.m., 0500 is 5 a.m., 1200 is 12 p.m., and then from there it gets a little bit weird, right? So if you know military time, 1300 is 1 p.m., 1700 is 5 p.m., 2200 is 10 p.m. It's helpful to write those out. If we need to, we will, and I'll give you some example questions where you would do that. But you're actually going to see that more so next semester when you start doing flow rates, because the question will be, you're doing rounds, it's 8 a.m., 0800, you see that somebody's on an infusion that's, there's 500 milliliters in the bag, 250 milliliter, it's set to go at 100 milliliters an hour. When will you need to replace that bag? Use military time. And so that's more of like a second, third, fourth semester question, but we'll address it just so you have some practice with it, but you won't see it. And then this last one is just paying attention to your syringes. If you have a syringe that you can mark the thousandths place on it, then do so. But I'm gonna be honest with you, I have yet to see that as a question on any of the 4 campuses that they needed to worry about, calculating a volume down to that small of a number. Usually it's the syringe is just, like I said, there's just a variety of pictures of syringes. And you'll see that as we go along with this. Okay. So that's what I wanted to do today, was to introduce some of these things. Are there any questions that you have, like right now, this kind of like on the format of the test, what to expect? And then also if the times I've given you, if those times are good or not. And if you don't want to unmute, you can always type into the chat. I'll also put my email address there just in case. I think you all have it, but
I just have one question. Are you going to teach all 3 methods, or do you focus on one?
so I I I don't have a method that I'm stuck to personally.
Okay.
I always tell students that when I do your math, when I do this math stuff, I just type it into the calculator and I get the answer, and I get it right every single time. Now, me telling you that does not help you, right? So, so I use a combination of, I'll show you, and I'll usually work through the problems a variety of different ways. I primarily focus on dimensional analysis. That's my preferred method for at least explaining this stuff, and then ordered over available. You can, and I'm assuming you mean the third option might be ratio proportion. Is that correct?
Yes, I like dimensional analysis, and I took another class on that, so that's what I
Mhm.
was just wondering what this one was focused on. So,
Yeah, so I try, because everyone's learned differently. I'm a big proponent of dimensional analysis.
okay.
And the reason I can kind of just plug in the things into my calculator to get an answer is because I can visualize what it would look like dimensional analysis. So I usually, if I always say, and I think I replied to your email saying that it's
Yeah.
almost like having a superpower, being able to utilize dimensional analysis, because if you ever get stuck, you have a strategy to kind of navigate to the solution, even if you really don't know what to do with the problem. But not everyone meshes with that. Not everyone likes that. But we will definitely cover dimensional analysis as a method for answering these questions. Yes.
Okay.
Probably not too much ratio proportion though. Um,
Okay. Thank
just
you.
because I don't use that too much. Um, but there's when we do the replacement volume question, there's some of that. Um, Can we use calculators during the test? Yes, you will be provided a basic 10 key calculator to use. So they'll give it to you to use, and then I'll also give you scratch paper. So you can't use your phone, you can't bring in your own calculator. They're going to provide it for you.
Are there other like practice tests that we could go off of? I know that the ones that you put up was like the ones that we got through Blackboard, as well as I think there was like an extra one that you did. But do you know if there's anywhere else that we could get extra practice on?
So right now, that's all that's available.
Okay.
And usually what I do if there are, because sometimes I'll set up a review session and then no one will show up and then I just kind of close out. When students show up, or even if you like if you can't come and you ask me a question like, hey, can you show me some examples of blah, or how would I do this, or like you just asked, like for an extra like kind of test. So what I usually do is I end up just kind of creating more questions during the review just to give you something to practice while while we're kind of learning the material. So like I'll take that practice set that I have listed in the OneDrive folder and even what's on Blackboard already, and then I'll kind of just add like 2 or 3 questions on top of each question, and then create like basically a new test from those question sets. The other thing that I like to do, and I've been really bad about, like I said, one of the reasons that I haven't made any new practice tests is just because just timing wise, it's not having time to do it. But what I typically do is like, next week when I do this, I'm probably going to spend most of the time talking about conversions. So metric to metric and then household to metric conversions, introducing that and then going through some practice problems and then having like a practice set of those problems. So that's usually how I handle that. And then each week I try and build on the different sections. Um, and then over time, basically instead of it just being like a 25 question practice set, I've given you like close to 100 different variations or 100 questions, giving you a variety of questions throughout the semester. And then if I have the time, which I think I do this semester, I'll create like a separate practice set. But one of the other reasons why I don't do that for you guys is because I don't know if it's live yet, but you'll have a practice Blackboard test. And that's a little bit more realistic of what you're going to experience, like clicking on, the different things, answering your question. When you mark a cup, it's very different on the Blackboard test because you're just moving your cursor to the line and then answering the question from there.
I also had another question. When I was going through like the practice set key as well as the other um like the practice test, I noticed that like questions 18 on the practice set and question 11 on the practice test were the same exact question, but it had different answers. Like one was like a half tablet and question 11 was 1.5.
So there's a good chance that the key is wrong. So if they're the exact same question and the order is the same and the available is the same, then I just made a mistake with the key.
So should we go with the practice set then? Or which one do you think we should go with, like to know that we got the correct answer?
You email me these, right?
Yes.
I will reply to that and then that way I can look at it because I don't have it pulled up right now. And then I'll give you feedback on that. But I would say you want to use both keys should be correct, but mistakes happen. And once I make it into a PDF and then it gets out into the internet, even though I have a little bit more control over all that stuff, it just, yeah, it probably was just a mistake and I'll try and make that correction. And then I'll give you feedback on what that is.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. And by the way, Christina, I do appreciate your email and your questions. I just haven't had time to respond to it, which is why we're getting like a short email from me saying like, I'm going to do a review, I swear.
No worries.
So I just letting you know that I have it pinned to my email to respond to it. And for anyone else that's emailed, just know that just bear with me. You guys have more time than you think than you would have for the initial semester. And I'm just wrapping up, kind of going through remediation for second, third, fourth. So that's one of the reasons why I've delayed kind of getting started. So, but all right. So, like I said, each of these sessions will only be about, 30 minutes or so. And part of that is because starting next week, right after this session, or actually right after your session ends at 2, I'm going right into Boyce 110 review. So, you're always welcome to stay on, especially if no one shows up to that, then you can ask more questions. But, also, if you don't know, these are not required. I'm not taking your name down. I'm not taking roll. It will be to your benefit, I think, in the long term for coming and getting your questions answered. And then we'll go from there. So I'll see you next week if you can be on, and if you can't, like I said, email me any questions you have.